minutes ago. It might not work with the.
What did you get rid of? It says it's being recorded.
I can do that. I can do that. I think what I'm realizing is that with the presentation being put on through Zoom, that it doesn't.
Somewhere though. Well, there it is. Good. We're good.
Right. This is an interesting scenario here. Okay. So the organization's mission, and this is also fun for us. We have just completed a strategic planning process. Cheryl Zalek, who's on our board and was part of that committee, I think you can appreciate how cool it is to see it up here on the screen. The board just voted to adopt a strategic plan yesterday, including a mission statement that does not change the scope of our mission at all, but we believe in how it's worded. So our mission is to protect forested land and support forest livelihoods through practices that maintain the long-term health of the land. You have no idea how many hours of wordsmithing went in to that sentence. But what we're really trying to convey and capture is that our forests need our help in terms of stewardship. We are responsible as landowners and land stewards to keep our forests healthy and resilient, not just for us, but for all of the wildlife that live there. But we also recognize our need to have forest products to help sustain our lives. I'm looking at, I think this is a hardwood and not a veneer here, piece of furniture. And so our organization exists to find really that delicate balance between stewarding working forests in a way that also maintains or enhances the ecological integrity of those forests. We have existed for the past 20 years. Our founder, Troy Firth, born and raised in Spartansburg, that's where we're headquartered in Crawford County. And to date, we have conserved almost 4,000 acres of forested land across northwestern PA and a couple properties in far western New York. For those of you, we have a celebrity in the room. For those of you who know Jane Woods, she is pictured behind the rock with a plaque on it, and she's also here in this room waving. Hi, Jane. She and her family, she donated the Ewing family woods to the foundation several years ago. It's just north of Corey in Erie County, and I could go on and on with time we don't have to talk about why that property is so important for conservation and how wonderfully cared for and loved it was and still is by Jane. But we're very fortunate, and I'm so glad that you're here, Jane, to hear this, because this was one of the sites that Steve will talk about in his study. So this slide exists to just show you the scope of what we're trying to accomplish. Our conserved lands are working forest lands. Most of them are open to the public for recreation, including hunting, but also hiking and other non-motorized passive uses. And as a working forest, we cut down trees, remove forest products, and contribute to that local economy. But what we're trying to do is do that in a way, as I said, that maintains or enhances the integrity of the landscape. And horses are part of that equation, certainly not the only one, but in terms of minimizing the damage. Anytime we go into the woods and cut down a tree, we're creating a disturbance. We know that, but we're trying to minimize that damage through techniques that I will talk about later on in the presentation. Oh, good, this works again. So this, can you admit that person? Oh, there you go, you did it, okay. So if you're not on social media, you might not understand all these icons, but it's kind of a nod or sort of a joke with Instagram. But ecosystem influencers are acting in our forests, whether or not we are. I'll say it again. So there are factors influencing our forests, whether or not we ever step foot in them. That can include climate change. It can include Pennsylvania's deer herd, which gave me a run for my money on the way up here. I'm very lucky that I didn't hit the deer that I hit any harder. I really just kind of tapped it. Pests and disease are prevalent. Most of our species of trees have their own, it's kind of trendy to have your own pest, your own disease. And then of course, our forests also exist with the legacy of human uses that came before us. Some of them helpful, some of them harmful. And this slide is really important because I'm sure there are people in the room who are wondering, why can't you just leave the forest alone? Why do you cut trees down to enhance forest health? Why can't you just leave them alone? And there are certainly forest ecosystems where that is the appropriate course of action, riparian zones, sensitive areas where there are endangered species. However, as I said before, forests in our area have a legacy of having been managed as working forests, and that legacy has degraded their condition over time. And whereas a forest before could handle a typical cut the best and leave the rest harvest, today they're showing signs that they can no longer handle, they can no longer bounce back from that disturbance. And so we are modeling a way of stewarding your forests that is keeping them or enhancing their resilience overall. And again, I'll talk about that. But this slide is really to speak to that question. It is a very valid question. Why don't we just leave them alone? And my 2 points there are, 1, we all rely on forest products in our lives. And 2, even a forest, whether or not you are trying to cut down timber, our forests are have been influenced and continue to be influenced by humans, whether or not we set foot in them. And so I look forward to speaking a little bit more about how we go about managing our forests, but I'd rather first bring in Steve Latta to talk about where he's coming from and how these 2 organizations partner together.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for inviting me and Annie, and happy to be here. We're going to bounce back and forth a little bit here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the National Aviary and the plight of birds. And then and sort of to set the stage for why this is such a wonderful partnership and collaboration between the aviary and the Foundation for Sustainable Forests. So the National Aviary is in Pittsburgh. It is designated by Congress as a national aviary, but we don't receive any funds, whether there's a shutdown or not. We receive no funds from the government. We're a 501c3, just like the foundation. So our mission is to inspire respect for nature through an appreciation of birds. And so part of fulfilling that mission, it takes place at the aviary on the North Shore in Pittsburgh, where we have, which is a sort of a bird zoo. We do a lot of education, and we also do a form of entertainment. We like to call it edutainment. Getting people excited about birds and as a way to talk about bird conservation. We're also sort of a repository for birds. So birds that may be threatened or endangered in the wild. Zoos are a really important source for breeding and for reintroductions. And so some of the species that we're particularly involved with, for example, the Guam kingfisher was extinct in the wild until a year ago. 9 individuals were reintroduced to an island in the Pacific. Three or four of those came from the National Aviary, and this year they began breeding. Guam rails, a similar success story. Andean condors, a number of other species were involved. But we also have a Department of Conservation and Field Research, and that's my department. And we focus on applied conservation problems that are linked to the impact on birds of a growing human population and increases in resource consumption. So how do these anthropogenic effects, these human-caused effects, how can we alleviate those in order to recover bird populations? And so we have research and conservation programs in a wide number of places in the New World, some of the longest term avian monitoring programs in the hemisphere, Dominican Republic, and at high elevations in Ecuador. We've worked a lot with the Louisiana water thrush, species you guys would probably know about, as a bioindicator of all kinds of contaminants and potential contaminants. Worked a lot in the Caribbean. And lead a search for the ivory-billed woodpecker, which we'll talk about sometime. So, but a lot of this work it revolves around this decline in bird populations and the number of individual birds in North America. And this study got a lot of publicity. This was in 2019, where a team of ornithologists came up with 2.9 billion for a loss of 2.9 billion birds just in North America since 1970. So in the last 50 years, we've lost almost 30% of all the individual birds in North America. To me, that's staggering. So where are all these birds? What are these birds that are being lost? If you're losing, 2.9 billion birds, you're not just losing threatened and endangered species. These are also your common backyard birds, things like catbirds and robins and thrushes and flycatchers. But you can break it down looking at different groups of birds. Not all groups of birds fare equally. If you look at the bottom, the most distressing proportions are down there. Grassland birds, for example. Think in terms of industrialized agriculture and the loss of grasslands. Those grassland birds are some of the hardest hit. I do want to point out, though, at the very top, the birds, wetland birds, there's actually been an increase in numbers of wetland birds. And that gives me hope, and I'll tell you why. If you think about wetland birds, you think first about waterfowl. And we put a lot of money and a lot of research and a lot of management expertise into waterfowl because, for hunters support it with their money and tax dollars and stuff too, of course. But to me, it goes to show that we have that knowledge, and if we put the effort and the funding into it, we can turn those numbers around. And that sort of research and management impacts not only the waterfowl but also the other species, the other wetland species that depend on similar habitats. So to me, that's something that I find encouraging in this otherwise bleak study. Of concern to us in this region are two groups of birds that I'm going to talk about tonight. One is what we call forest interior birds. These are birds that generally like or prefer or even require more mature forests, deciduous forests, eastern deciduous forests, and often they shy away from the edges. So they tend to, want to be more in larger blocks of forest or, away from those edges. So that's one group of birds. And that includes species like the red-eyed vireo, the thrushes. The wood thrush has gotten a lot of attention, sort of a poster child, if you will, for mature forest birds, ovenbirds, some warblers like the hooded warbler, redstart, black-throated blue, scarlet tanager. And then the other group of birds that we're concerned about, particularly in this region, are those that require early successional habitats. And these include things like catbirds. I think of catbirds as being quite common, but they've actually undergone a pretty remarkable decline in numbers. Whole suite of warblers: yellow warbler, chestnut-sided, mourning, common yellowthroat, towhees, song sparrows, indigo bunting. So, as conservationists, looking at this, working in this region and looking at this problem, I like to think of it as, maybe I don't like to think of it, but I think of it as a conundrum, this management conundrum, because we can create early successional habitat. That's easy. Go out, make yourself a clear cut, right? Within a year or two, you've got early successional, scrubby, young forest habitat. That's pretty easy to do. We might be able to do a better job of protecting, a mature forest or interior forest habitat, but that's a lot more difficult to create. But the real question is, if you're interested as ornithologists and land managers and conservationists, if you're interested in creating habitat or helping both of these sets of birds, the mature forest species and the early successional species at the same time, how do you do that? How can you do one and the other at the same time? And so that's what this project is about, and it builds off of the management practices that Annie's going to talk about that the foundation specializes.
Thanks, Steve. So I want to start out by saying that the work that I'm describing, the management I'm describing, I am not the forester with the Foundation for Sustainable Forests. Troy Firth, our founder, and Guy Dunkel, are the folks who are doing this work on the ground. And Troy is not a classically trained forester. He started out really through trial and error and observation. He was a history major in college. He is kind of a scholar in his own right, reading books of the readings of folks like Aldo Leopold. And it's through that he developed the land ethic. And Troy himself is not necessarily an avid birder. He notices them, he listens, he hears, but he did not set out to design a mode of forestry that would be beneficial to birds. It was a rather kind of, it was a coincidence. So what he was trying to do was create more resilient forests. And resilience is a bit of a buzzword these days, so I don't want to overlook the need to define it so we're all on the same page. Ecologically speaking, academically, resilience is the ability of a system to bounce back from disturbance. So a hurricane is a disturbance, a tornado is a disturbance, a fire is a disturbance, and people are disturbances as well. And so when we're talking about a resilient forest, we're trying to improve the ability of these forests to withstand whatever is coming next, whatever pests, climate change, any of the stressors that our forests are facing. And so these four characteristics are kind of what we identify the most as all together contributing to forest resilience. Overall tree health. When we select our trees for harvest, rather than taking the best and leaving the rest, we look for trees that are already compromised or diseased in some way, but still have some value in terms of economic benefits to the region. And we remove those trees instead. Troy calls it worst first. We try to cultivate species diversity, and I'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes. We try to diversify structure and age through our forestry. And it's that lower left-hand corner, what you're seeing in I'll actually divert your eyes up to the top left corner first. What you see there is a relatively even age stand. Yes, the trees are different sizes, but there's not a lot of structure in the understory. It's basically a closed canopy. It is kind of a mature, middle-aged forest. It is characteristic of most of the forests of our region after a long legacy of single tree selection. Now I direct your attention to the bottom left, where you see a little bit more structure. You see there, the understory is coming up. You see a canopy behind it. It is this structure that is more beneficial in terms of the diversity of wildlife. And then finally, in the lower right-hand corner is habitat. So we do our best to maintain different habitats through our management, again, to promote different species living there. So more on this, this concept of worst first. Instead of taking the highest grade trees, maybe you've heard that term high grading before, it is the status quo of harvests in our region. And it makes sense. The timber industry has never really bounced back since 2008 recession. And it's hard for people to make a living cutting timber in this area. So it stands to reason that they find themselves trying to cut the highest value timber. But we are here to say that that is a rather short-sighted decision. And I'm not criticizing the loggers who have to do that. Well, I'll criticize some, but I'm recognizing how challenging it is to make decisions that are good for the forest and earn a living. Just saying that out loud. But we are playing the long game, and we can't because we are a land trust. We're here to exist in perpetuity in the long term. So we make long-term decisions. And that includes selecting the worst trees, disease-suppressed trees, in order to leave the healthier trees behind to reseed the next generation. In this picture here, there are 3 cherry trees side by side. I would put forth, I wasn't there when they were born, but I would put forth that all 3 of those trees are exactly the same age. But the one in the middle is sort of losing the evolutionary race alongside its cohort. It's been suppressed, it's been outcompeted, particularly by the one on the right. If you look at the tree all the way to the right that has the biggest, fullest crown, that is the healthiest tree in that stand of 3. And we would choose to leave that one. And it's the tree in the middle that we would choose to harvest. That has signs of stress. It has epicormic sprouting, which is when you see branches going further down the trunk of the tree than the rest. Those are all signs of stress. It's just trying to stay alive. We will take that tree because it'll allow the other 2 trees to be more vigorous. And if they're more vigorous, then the next time a pest outbreak of some kind comes through, they will have a higher chance of surviving. Something like the emerald ash boring beetle. I'm not talking about specific to cherry, but the kinds of pests that move through the hemlock woolly note. So that is the concept of worst first tree selection. But worst first tree selection does not disrupt the age structure of a single age stand. It improves the vigor, but it doesn't do much to improve the age diversity of your stand. So this is where we practice group selections or expanding gaps. That is actually Steve, pictured in the lower right. I always like to say this. It's so great for pictures because he's so tall. You can see him amongst this tall brush. It's very handy. But this is a forest that is near Platia, not far from us here. It's unfortunately, not unfortunately, it's a beautiful name. It's called Flora Rose Forest. You might recognize multiflora rose as being the name of a common invasive around here. It's a total coincidence. Flora Rose is the amalgamation of Diane Esser's family names. And she is our conservation. This is her family's property, and she's our partner. So I only say unfortunate because it conjures visions of invasive plants, but it has beautiful. So in this picture here, you're looking at a place where we have clear cut a small open. And I used to be afraid to say clear cut out loud because we all know when we hear clear cut, we can and should have negative associations with that word. But this is an ecological clear cut. This was an ecological decision in a place that had good understory regeneration and maybe not so good overstory. Maybe those trees were diseased or aging out. We made the decision to cut the overstory so that the understory could thrive. And the understory these days needs all the help it can get. There's too many deer. They have a taste for native, juicy maples and other native tree seedlings. Any chance we can have to promote regeneration will ensure a future forest. But we don't do this lightly. We do not cut and hope. We make sure that we've done some work ahead of time in terms of invasive plant management. We make sure there are advanced native seedlings in the understory. And we also start with a very small cut. This is one of our biggest gaps, and I'll show you a video in a second. But we start small because it doesn't always go well. Sometimes it does get overgrown with invasives, or sometimes we accidentally get this monoculture of sweet birch that doesn't have a lot of ecological value, even though it's native, and it's quite invasive, even though it's native. So we are cautious. We introduce a little bit of light to the system, see how it will respond, and if it's responding well, then we can expand the gaps. And if you do this practice over time, you make this kind of quilt patchwork mosaic of different forest ages and of different species, because certain species need a lot of sunlight, like cherry, hickory. They need a lot of sunlight in order to grow. They can't grow under a closed canopy like other species such as sugar. So what you're seeing here is that gap from the air in Platea, and it is, see if I can back it up and make it happen again. It's showing you the different years that gaps were created. Troy orchestrated this. He made 2 gaps in year 1. The side light from those gaps promoted growth, so year 4 he cut the middle, and then the side light from all of those gaps 4 years later was producing promising results in the understory. So this is one of our very biggest gaps. Most of our gaps are quite a bit smaller than this, but I use this to show you that kind of patchwork mosaic that we're going. If you've noticed the crazy word on the top of the slide, that is Femmelschlag. Schlag, as I understand it, is a German term representing cut. Femmel, nobody I know who knows German has any idea what that means. But if you do, let me know. But it is practiced in Eastern Europe, where this concept of group selections and expanding gaps originated. So Femmelschlag is the practice that we're going for, and it has set the stage for that management conundrum that Steve was talking about in terms of how can you manage the forest for interior bird species and early successional species at the same time. The last thing I'll say before I pass it back to Steve, how important the actual forestry crew is. Because we work right now with 2 different pairs of Amish horse loggers who live in the area. They're not pictured here. They don't want to be photographed. That's fine. But we have other friends who would let us photograph them. But the use of horses alone does not guarantee ecological forestry. But when it's paired with good decision making about which trees are being cut and when, it is a great tool, because the horses have they make less damage to the forest floor than a mechanical skidder would. They still make mud. They still make disturbance. A harvest, whether or not it has ecological intentions, will still look messy for a few years after. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. But when horses come through and it's muddy, they might make about this much mud. If a mechanical skidder comes through, it might make about this much mud. But one of the biggest differences is with the horses, the dirt is still there. It hasn't been tracked all around through the woods, unrecoverable. It's still there. And when the harvest is over, we can go through and push it back. And we actually had Allegheny College students study kind of the plant regrowth on skid roads after a mechanical skidder versus horses. And that kind of affirms what we suspect, which is that we're doing less damage to the forest floor, less disturbance with the use of horses. The other thing we do is this idea of high frequency and low intensity harvests. Instead of coming in and doing kind of like a retirement every 20 to 30 years, big harvest, which is, I think, culturally ingrained in a lot of mindsets here, we're coming in every 5 to 10 years and doing a lighter harvest. So in terms of net benefits to the landowner, it's probably about the same. But we're just trying to be more cautious and take more of a long, because a big harvest these days is creating much more of a risk of invasives and other things, kind of creating really harmful conditions in your forest. So it's in that setting of these 6 sites around northwestern Pennsylvania that Steve and his team went about to answer that question. How are birds using these areas that are this uneven age system that you don't really see in too many places around here?
All right. So with that as background, we'll get into our addressing this, how we thought to potentially address this management conundrum. We hypothesized that based on some work that had been done actually on the Allegheny National Forest in very large clear cuts, 40 acres. We hypothesized that perhaps these small gaps, and we're talking an acre to up to 5 acres at most for this study. We hypothesized that these small gaps that the foundation created through this approach, this uneven aged forest management approach, would be used by birds in a number of ways. One is that we hoped that they would be nesting habitat for those early successional species, the towhees, the catbirds, those things that require, the low scrubby early successional habitat. And that those same species would stick around in those habitats once they fledge. When birds, there's a period of time after the birds fledge that is not very well studied for young birds or for the adults, where the young birds that have just left the nest, a lot of times they're not particularly good or can't even fly. They're still developing their feathers. They're learning how to hunt. They're learning how to avoid predators. That's a really key time for young birds, and that's where a lot of mortality happens. At the same time, the adults go through an annual molt, and so they're losing most, if not all, of their flight feathers, and they can be flightless for a time as well. So, and growing feathers, both for the young birds and for the old birds, growing feathers is really energy intensive. They need particular food. They need a lot of food, and they need cover from potential predators. So we hypothesized, we didn't know, but we hypothesized that those birds that are nesting in this thick early successional habitat would also remain there for during this critical period before migration. And then most interesting, and this is what comes from the work that had been done earlier on the big clear cuts, and was sort of a new finding, was that the birds that are nesting in the forest, those forest interior species that nest there, they're actually moving into early successional habitat. They're moving into these large clear cuts at the end of the nesting season, probably for unique food resources and or cover, but we don't really know. And so we hypothesized that we would see the same thing in these small gaps. But mind you, I mean, we're talking about 1 and 2 acre patches, gaps. We don't know whether the birds would find them. We don't know whether they're big enough that they would be used by the birds, or whether they were big enough that they would stay there. So, but that was our hypothesis. And so, so we're going. So we got together with the Foundation for Sustainable Forests because we knew that they were creating these small gaps, and we selected 6 forests in this region to work with, and working with Guy Dunkel, walked through the forest. We picked 38 gaps. And for us, gaps were defined as less than 5 acres. But as I said, the great majority of them were less than an acre up to 2 acres, and less than 10 years old. So these gaps, and we're going to talk about this, but these gaps change pretty quickly. And so in each gap, we placed a number of mist nets, mesh nets that we use to catch birds, to band birds, and then release them unharmed. And we visited each site 3 times a year in spring, midsummer, and late summer. So again, working with the mist nets, we're catching birds, we're banding them, uniquely banding them. We're determining the age, the species, of course, the age of the bird, the sex. We're collecting various data on the condition of the bird, how healthy it is, and then uniquely banding it, and then releasing the bird. So just jumping into some of the results. This is over a 4-year period, and these are just the top captures that we were catching. So those birds that are considered early successional, or birds that prefer or require scrub habitat, gray catbird, huge numbers, over 400. Veeries, mourning warblers, common yellowthroat, and then what we consider to be forest interior birds, hooded warblers, wood thrush, that species that I told you has become, there's a lot of interest in wood thrush as sort of a model species for forest interior birds, red-eyed vireos, ovenbirds. And we found good evidence through our mist net captures that the early successional species, we know they were nesting in there, and we were also catching lots of birds later in the summer, fledglings and adults that are molting. So here's, for example, a fledgling yellow warbler, common yellowthroat. It's a fledgling chestnut-sided. And this is an adult gray catbird that is molting. And unless you get these in the hand, sometimes it's hard to see this, but those the outer primaries there, the primaries are coming in, and then some of those coverts are coming in. Okay, so that's an adult. These are less obvious, but these are hooded warblers that are molting body feathers. And then turning to, that was a forest interior species. So another forest interior species, wood thrush, fledgling wood thrush. I can guarantee you that bird was not, it did not nest in those gaps, but it moved from the forest into this gap. Black-throated blue, same thing. American redstart. Well, and I might add, an awful lot of my work has been in the Caribbean and South America, so I don't get to see until I started this project, I didn't get to see these birds in this kind of condition before, and it's fascinating to me. But that bird has replaced all the primaries, but it's now working on those coverts. So those inner coverts are just pins right now. Similar condition, the ovenbird. See those pin feathers there on the covert. And then there's something you probably don't get to see very often, but an adult scarlet tanager molting into its non-breeding plumage. That's cool. So our preliminary findings, just from looking at what we caught in the mist nets, are that these small gaps that are created for forest management really are being used by birds. And that includes nesting habitat and habitat for post-fledging and for molting by the early successional species, and habitat for post-fledging birds and molting birds, the forest interior species. So this suggests that this uneven age forestry that the Foundation for Sustainable Forests is practicing can in fact be used to improve bird diversity in some pretty unique and some pretty important ways. But we're also interested in getting beyond that, beyond whether it's being used. We're interested in what gaps in particular are being used and why they're being used. All right, because we want to also be able to provide other management tools, other management options for forestry that might help improve outcomes for birds. So remember, those gaps that we chose were different ages, from a year old to 8 or 9 years when we started, and they're different sizes. A lot of them were less than an acre, some were up to 5 acres. So we're interested in how does the age of that gap and how does the size of the gap perhaps affect what birds are using that gap. And so that involved annually looking at how vegetation, both composition, the diversity of species, what species are in the gap, what plant diversity is in the gap, and then how it's changing, in structure. And it's changing very quickly. So we did a lot of measurement of vegetation, identifying vegetation. I won't go into these sorts of figures very much at all, other than to say that the younger gaps are well, anyhow, those groups points on the right are older. The older gaps, as you might expect, are more similar to one another because they have more trees, more saplings, a little bit higher, a little bit taller vegetation. On the left, you see gaps that are younger, that have a lot more shrubs, a lot more herbs, plants on the floor, grapevines, grasses. And then down at the very bottom, we didn't talk about this, but ferns, invasive ferns are a real problem on some of these sites. And if you have ferns, you basically don't get any regeneration. The site is not good for aim. But maybe Annie wants to talk about that. But and then we can take that vegetation data and look, and this is just an example, but this is the amount of cover of brambles. Brambles are blackberries and raspberries. Over the years, on the first 1, 2, and 3 years, old gaps, there's a lot of brambles. That starts to decline over time, but still there's quite a few by the time you get 10 years out. But still, it's an example where we might be able to pick a vegetation characteristic like blackberries or brambles and relate it to a particular species, maybe catbirds or something. But that's the kind of data. Those are the kind of data that we're getting out of the vegetation measures. But we're also still wondering why the birds are in the gap. What resources are they after? And for this, we brought in Cassie Ziegler, she's a doctoral student working on this project out of Duquesne University. And when I first started this work, I figured that the birds were in there for fruit. That was kind of my tunnel vision. I just thought they're coming in for fruit because it's late summer. That's when a lot of the fruit are coming into season, and a lot of migratory birds, just before they migrate, they kind of gorge on particular types of fruit for energy and to put on weight. And so in these gaps, I've mentioned blackberries and raspberries, but grapes, pokeberries, spicewood. There's multiflora rose, which we'll talk a little bit about. It's an invasive, but it's eaten by birds. Elderberries, in some cases. But then a little bit down the road, I started thinking about insects and other arthropods, and I realized that these sites that have so many saplings and so much vegetation, it's really full of caterpillars and other insects, and on the ground underneath all the saplings, there's a lot of arthropods, and so that might be a factor as well. And then, as I said earlier, vegetation can confer protection from potential predators, especially aerial predators. So that may be a factor. So Cassie's approach to looking at what these birds are using is to look at fecal samples, poop. We have the advantage of that when you catch a bird in a mist net and you put it for a moment in a paper bag before banding it, almost always, and within a minute, maybe 2 minutes, it's going to defecate. And so we were able to collect lots and lots of fecal samples for Cassie. She decided, because we had so many, she decided to focus on 2 species. One is the catbird as a kind of example for the early successional species, and then the wood thrush for the forest interior species. And we don't need to understand all this, but what she's doing is using what's called next-gen sequencing. It's a fancy way of looking at DNA. So we take the fecal samples, process them, and then you look at the DNA of everything that's in that fecal sample. And she's able to look at both plant material and animal material, the insects and arthropods. And then we're also collecting blood samples, which is a pretty standard procedure. And that, I'm not going to try and explain this, but you can look at what are called stable isotopes. It's different forms of carbon, different forms of nitrogen that are in that have a signature in the blood. And the point of this is that the fecal samples using the sequencing, you're just getting presence absence. Did it eat this geometric caterpillar or not? Right? It doesn't tell you whether it gorged on them and had 90% of its diet were these caterpillars, or whether it was just a one-off. But when you work in the stable isotope data, you can get a better idea of relative quantities of these things. And so some preliminary observations, Cassie's still hard at work on this, was that, well, first, that there wasn't any really significant significant variation in diet between years, which is kind of interesting. You might expect if there's variation in insect abundance or whatever, it may vary. The key arthropod orders, or the insects, or that she found were Lepidoptera, the caterpillar, dipterans or flies, coleopterids, the beetles, and then key plant families, Rosaceae, which is that introduced rose along with blackberries and raspberries we talked about. I'll skip to the Fagaceae, which is oaks and beech. Yeah, oaks and beech. And then the Caprifoliaceae is a honeysuckle, which here is mostly an introduced exotic. There was a seasonal dietary shift. So, and this didn't really surprise us, but as I explained, like later in the season, later in the summer, they shifted more from the caterpillars and the flies and the beetles to more of the fruits, and especially those blackberries and raspberries. But also, there's also some use of honeysuckle, especially early, maybe before the other berries came on. They were going for that honeysuckle. So she still has to get into the stable isotope data, and then she's going to look at differences between adults and juveniles. It may very well be that those juveniles have unique diets compared to them. So just briefly, I want to point out that this research, it's a really great educational tool. Annie and I love to take this talk to various groups and stuff, but it's also education and training for the field crews that help out with this and really do the heavy lifting. So we get undergraduates that get tremendous research experience in field ornithology. We had one bander get certified by to become a professional bander, which is not an easy thing to do. We got three master's degrees out of this, and Cassie's completing her PhD. So one fairly small, modest research program can really be a boon in terms of education. And Annie will wrap us up.
Just going back to this slide, this was a really wonderful group of people. They called themselves the Gappers. They kind of moved seasonally with the birds. And if you ever want yourself to feel like a celebrity yourself, buy a box of donuts and go find a crew like this at 5:30 or 6 a.m. where they've been up for hours, and you will feel very appreciated. That's what I want to say. It was one of my favorite things to do with that group. So this research all by itself is interesting and compelling. But for the Foundation for Sustainable Forests, we want to make sure that we don't miss the point. The point being, we didn't start out to manage our forests for birds, but anecdotally we knew or suspected we were benefiting birds. But now we know a little more detail. Steve and his team have unpacked that for us a little better, and we want to make sure moving forward with our stewardship that we don't miss the point. So there will be more conversations and questions between our management team and Steve, but we at least feel affirmed that the practice of uneven-aged forestry, Femmelschlag, is beneficial. We want to continue our light-handed approach, and as to whatever extent we can. And again, I don't want to sugarcoat, every decision to go into the woods and do a harvest is a disturbance. There are costs, there are costs to that you have to balance with the benefits, but we do feel as though from this research we have real data to affirm that our approach is benefiting multiple different types of birds. And then finally, the work particularly about who is using the gaps when throughout the summer, we found very compelling, and that we're going to look for ways for that to inform the timing of our harvest when we are creating new gaps, for example, to try to minimize the costs to the bird populations that rely on those sites. There will be a learning curve for us, but I just wanted to say that, you know, as interesting as this research is, we want to make sure that we take it somewhere in terms of our own stewardship. And to that end, Alda Leopold, there are so many quotes. I don't think I go a single month without Troy quoting a thing is right when it does. You know, there's a number of quotes that guide the foundation and our organization. But to this point, I really like Alda Leopold's quote here. He wrote, "To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering." And this is in his very well-known work, the Sand County Almanac. But what that means to us is that as we are doing our management for different ecological outcomes, to foster different species, to produce forest products, we need to make sure that we are not accidentally removing a key or critical ecosystem component from the system. And if at the end of the day, we are keeping these forests intact as functioning ecosystems, then at the very least, we're kind of following the Hippocratic oath, first do no harm, right? So it's easy to talk about in this setting. It's a lot harder to do on the ground. So I give a lot of credit to Guy and Troy for kind of making hard decisions every day that they go into our woods. But we certainly keep quotes like this guiding, words like this in our minds. And then lastly, I want to say that we were really fortunate to be able to work with an Erie-based filmmaker, Vincent Dragone of Dragone Media, while Steve and his team were doing their research so that we could capture some of their work being done in the field. So this can be found on our website, although I will admit not easily. I think I need to put it on our homepage so you can just go there and find it easily. Or you could scan that QR code if you're interested. It's just like it's a 12 or 14-minute film that talks about this research, and Vincent captured just really gorgeous footage as well. So I just want to say on behalf of Steve and myself, I want to thank the Presque Isle Audubon Society for having us and for working through our technical difficulties at the beginning. Thank you. And I don't know if we have time for questions or not. I know it's a little bit past time.
Yes, we do.
Yes,
We have
do.
a yes. Okay. Why don't you come on up here, Steve? I saw that. That's John Farmer in Michigan. Hi, John. I don't know how you want to field the questions, but we're happy to answer if we can.
Well, I have a question for starters, and it would help if you guys could repeat them because you have the mic. But also for those at home, just put them in the chat or turn your camera and mic on, and we'll go ahead. Oh, I do see somebody having a question, so let me defer in mine, and John Farmer, you can turn your mic on and just ask the question if you like.
Okay,
There you
my
go.
mic's on and I'm not asking
Let's
a
see if we can
question.
hear
I
you.
was trying.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Hold on 1 second. Let's see. Okay, could you please try again?
Okay, I had no question. I was having trouble seeing the options along the bottom of the screen and may have hit something unintentionally. But I want to thank you for making this available online. It was very interesting presentation, and appreciate seeing it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Have Mark have a question.
So you talk about smaller birds, what about roots? That's been a bird that's been historically here in these parts. Does this help them at all? Or do you know anything about it?
Yeah, so the question was about some of the larger birds, for example, woodcock, whether they benefit from this. we would occasionally see woodcock, but we didn't. It wasn't in enough numbers to do anything with. There were species that, for example, another species that that people are really interested in this part of the country is golden winged warblers. And we think that these gaps are probably not large enough for some of those species, like the golden wing, or maybe we're a little bit farther west where they're larger numbers, but we didn't get golden wings. We sometimes got ceruleans, which was another species we're interested in, cerulean warblers, but not in numbers that we can see. Oh, yeah.
No.
And I can only speak anecdotally to your question, Mark, but I live on a farm where I'm in Woodcock Township in Crawford County, and woodcocks love to do their displays in the spring on my farm. And I think the edges of our gaps are maybe a little too feathered for their liking. I think they like the more discreet, at least that's, like I said, he's the expert. That's anecdotal. And I do know from the Ruffed Grouse Society that they would say that most of our gaps are too small to benefit grouse.
I have sort of a twofold question. On the forestry side, you said light touch. Does that include at all invasive species management? And on the ornithological research side, is there any data coming in from, what was it, 4 years study? How birds affect the habitat back in this specific scenario, sort of the engineering habitat, disperse, seed, anything really? Have you been collecting that type of data?
So there was a two-part question. I'll work on the first while Steve thinks about the second. The first was, when we talk about a light touch, does that include invasive species management? The second part is about, is Steve and his team looking at how the birds affect the ecosystem back, kind of the reciprocal relationship. So related to invasive species,
I'm not sure if we're recording.
we do manage invasive species to whatever extent that our budget allows. And in fact, part of the strategic planning process that we just finished is this kind of stark reality that the cost of stewarding forests for non-commercial activities like invasives is only going up. I have a new kind of animosity for unauthorized ATV use because of how fast they spread stilt grass through woods. But so we do manage for invasives, and we do use herbicide applications, and that is a cost benefit analysis a decision that we have made. The degree to which we do it, whether there's a lot of degrees. You can do a fog spray when, in some cases, if an ecosystem in an area is considered a total loss, that is the right prescription. Or you can do a lighter touch backpack application, but that's a cost benefit analysis, a reality. So on to Steve for the question about birds, the reciprocal relationship between birds and forest.
Yeah. I guess I don't really have an answer for you. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of like seed dispersal, some of those sorts of impacts that birds can have on an environment, on a habitat. It's hard to study, and it's not something that we looked at, but it's potential.
The wood or woods?
It's neither
Woods?
here nor there, but it did make me think about the number of birds. Like, because we're there for 4 years, we got a lot of birds that are returned, recaptured. So birds they're returning to these small gaps for 2, 3, 4 years. So they're finding something that they like. So that's great.
In fact, my favorite story on that end was the hooded warbler that was recaptured in Blooming Valley Forest near Meadville, that had been originally banded
There
by
it is.
Ron Mummy of Allegheny College 8 years prior, I believe. So think about that, 8 trips between the neotropics and here and came right back to Meadville area. Carmen?
Steve, the Game Commission contributes the decline in the grouse from the West Nile virus. Did you see that in any other species, and is that possible for the woodcock?
Yeah, I know there's good data, as you said, on the grouse. I don't know, I haven't seen anything particular on the decline.
And you guys women doing all the blood work, finding stuff.
Everybody's seeing it.
Can I make an announcement? I always have paper bags on the back table. It would be really nice if people took everything I said. That means you.